Hey there. As you know, college is getting more and more expensive, especially for middle and low-income students. You've probably noticed that, but did you know that this isn't just a problem with one or two schools? Over the last 40 years, the cost of going to college has tripled, even after you account for inflation. Today, getting a bachelor's degree in the US can cost nearly $250,000. Yep, you heard that right. $250,000. But here's the thing, I'm starting with UC schools for a reason, and I'll explain why by the end of this video. It all comes down to these two letters AA. Most people don't know what this is, but it's crucial. This A rating is for the bonds issued by the University of California, a public university system. Believe it or not, these two little letters explain a lot about how, over the last 20 years, investors, university admins, and the state have come together to make college more expensive while making education worse. Let's break it down. So, why does tuition keep going up? And why does it seem like there's no end in sight? It's all about how schools stopped focusing on giving people the best education and started treating education as just another way to make money for the rich. Every year, tuition goes up, but it doesn't just make college more expensive for students. It also makes education worse by cutting teaching positions and giving priority to fancy buildings and real estate projects. All while the people running these schools, the top brass take home bigger and bigger paychecks. So, how did we get here? How did higher education become financialized? Before we talk about financialization, we need to talk about commodification, when education went from being a public good to something you buy. There isn't a single event that made this happen. In the US, higher education has always been a mix. On one end, you had elite private schools that treated education like a luxury. Back in 1934, for example, Dartmouth was the most expensive place to get your bachelor's degree in the US, costing around $30,000 a year in today's money. Meanwhile, public education was almost free in places like California and New York, thanks to systems like UC and CI. At one point, the UC system didn't charge any tuition at all. But things started to change in 1921 when they introduced a small incidental fee for in-state residents. Even then, public schools kept tuition low until about 1968. That's when things really started to shift. By the late 60s, the idea that college should be accessible to everyone started to crumble. And there were two big reasons for that: Ronald Reagan and the Higher Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, let's talk about the Higher Education Act. The idea behind it was to give students easy access to federal loans to pay for college. The government figured that since a college degree meant higher-paying jobs, students would be able to pay back those loans, no problem. But that's not what happened. Instead of making education more accessible, this act, combined with state funding cuts, led both private and public schools to raise tuition. Colleges realized they could charge more because students could just take out loans to cover the cost. Almost overnight, education went from being a public good to a private commodity that you buy with debt. But why do colleges keep raising tuition, even when they know it's putting students in massive debt? Well, in 1998, the California Legislative Analyst released a report that showed all income growth over the previous 20 years went to the top 20% of earners. Colleges took this info and ran with it. They realized they were selling more than just education. They were selling a safety net against falling into the bottom 80%. This fear of falling behind, let colleges keep raising tuition without improving education quality. Why? Because what really matters is the spread of earnings after college, not the quality of education. And then, in 2009, the UC Board of Regents announced a huge tuition increase, 32%. For the first time, tuition for in-state residents at a public school was over $10,000 a year. In just 10 years, the cost of going to a UC school as a California resident went from about $3,000 a year to over $12,000. That's crazy. And how did the UC system justify this? They blamed budget cuts. But that's not the whole story. Here's what really happened. UC schools started issuing what are called general revenue bonds. Basically, they asked investors for big loans in exchange for regular payments until the loans were paid off. What makes this interesting and a little scary is how they convinced investors to buy these bonds. UC schools raised tuition and pointed to their ability to keep raising it as proof that they could pay back the bonds. Investors loved this because it was a safe bet. The state couldn't raise taxes easily, but universities could raise tuition whenever they needed to, so their credit ratings went up. But here's the kicker: UC schools use tuition as collateral for these loans. So instead of using tuition to improve education or make it more affordable, they used it to pay back investors. They spent this money on new buildings, housing, and sports centers to make the university look better on rankings lists. Why? Because a better brand means a higher credit rating, which means they can issue more bonds in the future. It's a vicious cycle. But what does this mean for students and staff? It means that paying back these bonds takes priority over everything else. Schools can't lower tuition or focus on things like teacher pay because they have to make sure they can repay their investors. As a result, schools across the country are cutting full-time teaching jobs and replacing them with part-time lecturers who make a lot less money and have way less job security. By some estimates, 70% of professors in the US are now part-time. The same goes for dining and custodial jobs. They're being outsourced and replaced with cheaper, less secure positions. But while everyone else is feeling the squeeze, university administrators are getting paid like they're in the private sector. After 2004, when this financial strategy took off, their salaries were reset to match those of private sector managers. This means that while everyone else is struggling, the people at the top are doing just fine. The public university is being remade in the image of a private corporation, with all the income inequality that comes with it. So, what are we left with? Tuition keeps going up, schools keep getting more money to fund fancy projects, and wealth inequality gets worse. This benefits capitalists because the more schools increase inequality, the better their investments do. Meanwhile, students and staff are left with massive debt and a worse education. This isn't a system that works. It's a system that treats education like any other financial asset, and that's not what education is.